All right, welcome back for another episode of the Unplanned Show. With me today, Andrés Vega, who has been on the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's Security Technology Advisory Group. I was like, wait, last minute, I'm like, is it a council? Is it a group? What is that last letter in the acronym? So excited to have Andres on with me today, digging into cloud native security as a broader topic, but also, he's got some great thinking and ideas around compliance and governance, all of which I think is really relevant. And we were just talking about how unplanned work is very much a part of that world. Before we get into today's discussion, just a quick reminder about some of the upcoming shows that we have. Next week, we will not have a live show. I'm going to be at Monkey Gras in London. Please say hi if you're there, or if you're in or around London or can get to it. Great show to check out with the Red Monk crew around the theme of prompt craft. So really excited to be participating in that one. Then we'll be back with Davis Godbout and Chris Bell talking about major incident management. So these are capitalized letters, so it's a thing. And then on March 25th, we will have April Song from Databricks on talking about ML ops, machine learning operations. So that's another really exciting hot topic, kind of in and around the AI space, given that it depends a lot on those machine learning algorithms. As always, you can catch the audio replays on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please leave a review. Let me know if you like it or don't. And with that, let's get into today's topic. Andres, we had talked about this kind of as a starting point, the sort of difference between compliance and governance. And when you put that in some of the notes, I was like, I want to start there, because that I think is really good framing to just understand this whole broader topic. So how would you describe that? Let's set the stage that way.
Yeah, governance really broadly is the organization that you're part of as a whole working towards the way they say they would, like the norms that dictate here's how we ought to do things in this place. That is governance, and the concept and the when you direct that to the software engineering function, ultimately is what we're building and how we're building it. Is it yielding value, and are we at the same time mitigating risk? That's very often mixed with compliance, and governance is not necessarily about compliance. Compliance is the act of, did you actually do what you said you would? So that distinction between here's this high level set of objectives and our values and virtues as an organization, and how we protect our brand reputation and how we generally operate, versus, well, now we have to demonstrate that we actually did that. And if we look at, I mean, it's really important, the things that we're doing right now to attempt to redefine governance, because today we're still responsible for corporate failures in the 90s. A lot of people in the space, one of the objectives they have to meet is Sarbanes-Oxley. But most of the people right now, with a few exceptions, weren't around when what led to having SOX in place, like the Enron and the WorldCom failures, to be responsible for that. So we're largely cargo culting practices from when software was largely built differently, and it wasn't as critical for the business. But now that we have components that are much more critical to the existence of the organization, to the well-being of the business, the risk associated to the development hasn't decreased, much less with machine learning. So there's this downward pressure of a lot more code, more complex systems. And a lot of the folks in the AI ML field have embraced cloud native architectures in the sense of they have multiple component parts that are loosely coupled together, but there's lack of a schema or a specification that's well articulated on those ML workflows. And what ends up happening, and we saw it recently with Google's Gemini, is you don't really know what you're shipping until you do.
Mm. Okay, so if we just to kind of come back and like that base concept, governance versus compliance. Compliance, just are you doing what you said you would do, and governance, what should you be doing? But all and like kind of this idea of almost a lag between what your requirements might be, and what like from a compliance perspective, and what your requirements might be from a business perspective, or or just keeping up with the times, if you will. Is that
Yeah,
that sort of I'm sensing this like lag when you talk about kind of how we're sort of cargo culting certain governance practices that stem from challenges 20 years ago or more. um, that they possibly aren't serving us well, but we still follow them because we're still required to.
for sure, for sure. So history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does tend to rhyme. And when we have this reactionary responses, so we talked about like the some of the frameworks like SOX that most people are acquainted with. But if we go look at more recent ones, there's always a industry or societal catalyst for it. Right now, a lot of people are scrambling to meet and adhere to the executive order 14028, the CISA self attestation, NIST SSDF, which were the response to high profile breaches and attacks.
Mhm.
Uh, we see NIST CSF, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework uh, 2.0 published last week. For a significant update to CSF in over 10 years, there's suddenly a whole lot new into it. And one of the new called out functions is govern, precisely for the emphasis of it has to be connected, it has to be associated to the rest that the organization does as a whole. And a practical way to think that my narrative arc, I've primarily been a product manager in software organizations in different sizes. As a product manager, your job is different every day. You wear different hats depending on what stage is the product you're working on. Early on, you're going to be spending a lot of time with your engineering team if you're not talking to customers. As you've released a product, you're working with product marketing, you're working with sales to perform sales enablement, you're talking to larger groups of customers as opposed to individual customers. So compliance and governance, when you have a non-compliance event, it's one of the few activities or one of the few tasks where it's all hands on deck, all stakeholders. It's not one on one. It's probably the only arena where senior executive leadership of the company is in the mix. And you have general counsel, and you have uh, trust and safety, the different lines of defense. So it is very different to everything else in that regard, because it is the bloodline of the business. Everything is a stake, and for how we've done things, and the practices that we've cargo culted, if you've been busy developing and delivering software, you're kind of dealt with compliance as much of security people did traditionally as an afterthought.
Mm.
You are making the adjustments necessary or the corrections in order to hit that regulatory or that compliance objective. But these things often tend to be uh, the same as architecture. If you have a non-compliance event, the same as if you would have a, a quality issue and you have recurrent bugs, it's not a one-off. It's likely a systemic issue. So you can go look back at how do you think before you ship something entirely about what's the analysis around those areas. Is the software thoroughly tested? Do we have the security controls in place? Is reliability a first class consideration, as we're hearing from Brian Kroger on the last uh, podcast from last week? So there's all these aspects that they're not opposed to. Okay, we've done this. Now, how do we scramble to, if you're shipping software to the government because we have a federal contract, uh, to hit the marks there? If we're serving medical device companies or if we're serving banks and we need to do these different things for them, if there's a common denominator across the different regulatory objectives, like thoroughly tested as the same, regardless of how you're presenting it to match the language of that particular framework. If you're doing these things across the board rather than going back to and building and delivering software to regulated organizations, if we're doing it for the Department of Defense, how can we reuse and carry those stringent set of controls so we're not having to repackage it for someone else, but is essentially the same artifact one and for all that tackles the different aspects that the governing body or an accreditor or a regulator might go look for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing, like what you're describing is, eh, I mean, for lack of a better term, right? A lot of the shift left that we've heard about in sort of DevSecOps rhetoric, and it fits in cloud native security. I do want to touch on what makes it cloud native, but that whole the before you even get to the technology and what's capable in different architectures, just the notion of, are you shifting left, and asking these questions before you ship code, and before you get to the last stage, the last gate before you ship code,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's security or compliance. Or thank you for giving a shout out to, reliability as a first class feature, and all of those things, doing them early, because because the non-compliance event later can be such a massive escalation, all the way up to the most senior ranks of a company with a lot at stake.
Mm-hmm.
And you also listed a lot of new, I don't know if regulations is the right word, but a lot of new standards that folks need to are scrambling, I think was the word you used, to try to comply with. And so all of that, it definitely feels like the balloon's getting squeezed at both ends, where if you're not figuring out how you're going to meet some of these new standards for, um, particularly like the secure software supply chain, if you're not doing that now, like you're going to be hit with non-compliance, um, in the future,
For
because
sure.
now is the window to sort of get your act together. And at the same time, it's not something that you want to add on at the end. So it's like you have to shift it even earlier. So the balloon's kind of squeezed at the other end, in terms of all of your upfront design and practices have to also be the ones that move first. Um, Otherwise, you're kind of ending, if you're just sort of, how do we tick the box, if that's even possible, then you could be setting yourself up for a lot of unplanned work.
For sure, for sure. So yeah, on the front end, you have this downward pressure of regulatory objectives, which, if not attended to, results in lawsuits, fines, civil money penalties, depending on the sector you're on. And on the back end for the teams is a lot of the stress, is a lot of toil. There's a lot of frustration and manual evidence collection and presenting information that oftentimes is not deemed satisfactory because the fact that you're proficient at building something doesn't necessarily mean that you're able to articulate or in a good position to articulate how's this consistently enforced across the system. And oftentimes it's better to remove yourself out of the equation and delegate it to the machine. Yes, there's an element of shift left on inevitably it's not a matter of better procedures and new functions. It's not about, okay, how much more data can we produce if the data is produced by people filling out questionnaires and capturing screenshots of spreadsheets. It's not as rigorous as it should be. Now, if you shift it left and you're imposing on your development team that's already responsible for performance, availability, and certain places are also being asked to be on the hook for security. Uh, they're doing already they're like redlining, right? So imposing them to become, oh, you need to learn and go read the latest legalese of this of new framework or standard, or how that has changed like internal corporate standards. It's a lot, but we do see pioneering organizations, rather than asking their engineers for more, we see hiring engineers to staff these functions that previously you would have had someone with a legal background or an audit background. Much like we saw pioneering organizations in the 2000s hire software engineers to handle system administration. And in the last decade, we've seen software engineers handle to do security operations, to build and run the software that automates a lot of these tasks. So there is an emergence of new jobs on compliance engineering, people that are good developers that are expected to build software that will collect evidence, that will enforce controls, that will set up those gates to ensure that, yet again, the software hits the expected attributes that have been outlined by corporate governance or the contracts that exist with the clientele that is being served.
Okay. So that's super interesting. And I want to come back to something else that you said that I think is part of this concept of almost like a new role that exists and why. And it was about like delegating to the machine. Um, Tell me a little bit more about what you mean in this context around this notion of what gets delegated to the machine, because to your point, it's like this is asking a lot of developers on top of already a lot that's being asked of them,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of complexity, and and you know, it kind of gets into the whole speed paradox that ultimately slows innovation, right? So how do you manage that and still have your teams able to innovate? So let's come back to like I just want to understand like what do you mean by the delegating to the machine from
For
this
sure, for
perspective?
sure. So framing it yet again on the persona of the developer. You're building software. It meets the expectations. Uh, Leadership signs off, and it gets shipped. Now that's great, but what happens when there's a non-compliance event? Uh, there's a lot of people that get into a war room, and we talked about, yes, you get like senior executives engaged and you get all the different functions, but ultimately the pressure falls back on what today is the platform team or the DevSecOps team to go address uh, whatever is inadequate or whatever is deficient. Now, if you go and address those sharp edges, or whatever the delta is, and you do it that one time, it's unplanned work, but likely challenging and rewarding. But if for the next release that happens again, and now you're expected not only to do it per release, but every commit should hit all these marks. Uh, and having to address that manually every time is cumbersome, is tedious, is not a good use of time. So ensuring that, much like software development best practices, that you are doing your SAST, your DAST, you have ideally this day and age IAST in place, that you understand the provenance of the dependencies on your software. And it's not, well, I have to go look at my build server and here are the inputs and here's the layout. You're very well able to have something more modern like an SBOM, even a VEX file, to say, hey, here's what's gone into this artifact, and here's the scan results for that, and we know that this vulnerabilities, while present, are not exploitable or false positives. So if you're able to aggregate, certainly someone could perform that manual inspection, but if you're able to observe or have a system or platform for governance observe all these different attributes, that whatever policy derived from the corporate governance objectives, uh, it's in line, and that you are hitting the presence of those attributes, or if there are thresholds for what's the total number of acceptable high vulnerabilities for something that is not internet facing, that may not go to a production environment, versus what's that definition for something that is in prod. What is your testing threshold for a particular code base in a given language, depending on like the vintage and lineage of that class of application. So removing, well, we know we do these things, but rather than me, like you, taking it at face value, or if I convince engineering leadership and we see the practice of like signing a secure development lifecycle statement or a self attestation of,
Mhm.
yes, to the best of our knowledge and ability, we do all these things. And many of these statements go even to governments. We see it go to, like in the UK, the NCSE passed this royal assent, similar to the executive order, and a lot of vendors have had to produce this long statement, and you sign it, as opposed to say, hey, here's the machine produced evidence. It's an attestation. It has been observed at the moment it occurred. Uh, it's digitally signed. It's cryptographically verifiable. It can be repudiated. It stands much stronger, and can also be produced more rapidly, rather than tasking someone to go fetch this information.
Okay. And so, like, getting to the point where you can use you can have that machine produced attestation, right? Like, that's not going to be on day one. So how does an organization get from where they are today, where which I realize I could be in a lot of different places, but getting from a place where a lot of this work is being done manually, and they're dealing with their non-compliant events. Oh, I nearly had a non-compliant event with my water glass there. Um, would have resulted with a lot of water on my keyboard. Um, uh, so how do they get
Yeah.
from, hey, we're doing this manually, and you know we want to get better, but how do we get
Yeah.
there?
So there's actually a lot of advances of and there's a large amount of prior art, starting from most of it really. Banks pioneered the automated governance space, so we can go look at organizations like HSBC and Capital One have done a lot of work on frameworks around automated governance and open sourcing them. Some of it are no longer maintained, but 2018, 2019, folks in the DevOps Enterprise Summit for when they do their get-togethers and write papers, they wrote a paper envisioning an automated governance framework. It's called the DevOps Automated Governance Reference Architecture. It was written in 2019. Very influential people got together trying to extrapolate from how they had done things to date. Largely, a lot of people have done it in a vacuum. And I like to joke with respect for people who work in banking that every bank has already built a broken version of this, but there's not a lot of standardization or interoperability where you can present like a regulator and auditor, here's how we all do it the same way. So there's a lot of variance. So the paper postulated using an event-driven architecture, taking cloud native parts like Kubernetes. At the time, they proposed GraphES. They proposed using an event-driven architecture. So, and the CI/CD pipeline, when a task occurs, capture the raw webhook of that task, get the context of like where in the sequence was it happening, like essentially make this a DAG, express that DAG, and make sure that every single step is executed. In every step, evaluate that task against a predefined policy control. So you can take things like Open Policy Agent, or you can take things like AWS's new policy language, Cedar. So much like a bank would be asked, like, hey, you got to know your customers, you got to know your robots, you got to know the machines that built the software. And when the machines are rapidly slinging JSON or YAML at each other, capture those events, compare everything that occurred against your intent, and determine whether the policy passes or fails. And for audit and logging, and later on for regulatory reviews, ensure that that's stored somewhere at the time they use GraphES. Since then, there's been developments around frameworks like Project Six Store and the different components that make Six Store up to make sure that you have a transparency ledger that cannot be repudiated, that cannot be falsified, of when did that occur, and you can go check it down in time to ensure whether at that point in time you're compliant or not. So with like new frameworks and with like, sorry, there's like a drill going off in the background, and it's a little bit disorienting. Okay, they stopped. So with like SEC, where there's a new mandate that in the event of a breach, if the event has material impact to the business, you must notify about it immediately. Or if not, the organization, and even down to an individual level, it can be held as negligent for not having done so. But even in the event of a breach, like forensics gets deployed, and there's often not enough data to ascertain what was the state of the system. And in a distributed system, who are the actors? What's the relationship of those services one to the other? Showcase that relationship again, like produce a directed graph of all the objects and subjects in the system. So taking this building blocks from the parts bin of cloud native, we have the means to canonically identify all the assets in the system. How are the assets interrelated to one another? And every time there's a commit or there's a deploy, record that, hash it, store it in somewhere. It can be even made a zero knowledge proof. And whenever the auditor needs to look up that information, they can then make the evaluation of uh, was there compliance or was there not non-compliance.
Okay. So just couple post-processing notes, and then there's another kind of related topic that you had mentioned before that I want to come back to. Um, but I liked your point about, like, you gotta know your robots, right? And almost like setting up a system in which you're able to capture the events as they're happening and compare them, right? Or at a minimum, you're, uh, every commit that's occurring, you're storing it, right? For later review, from a compliance perspective, which is sort of maybe a later step in this process, where first you kind of have to set up just knowing, like, where are the events occurring. Um, and that's probably oversimplifying, but is that kind of in terms of that maturity model, going from completely manual to just starting by know your robots and know your software and know, like, are where changes are occurring that could be the types of events that need to be looked at, and just start by developing a system that's going to be helping you with that stage, and then you kind of move earlier and earlier in order to ensure that those things are happening as they occur. Is that fair?
So for sure. So if we look across the board at high performing organizations as deemed by Dora, and you ask them like, do they know how fit they are in terms of their practices? You're going to get some level of like anecdotal and institutional answers. You can go sit with a principal engineer or a distinguished engineer, and they can detail how they do things across the board. But someone who an individual developer may not be able to answer to all the aspects. But when and this is the person or the product person often called to attest that they're doing all these different things. Now, when you ask the person like, well, like prove to me that, well, you seem to know this, but like prove it to me. Like, where's the evidence for it? And how strong is that evidence? Uh, and how like good or bad is the answer if you do know the answer to the question. Uh, so when you get to that point, and maybe the organization is building software 5,000 times a day.
Mhm.
Okay, like, yeah, this presumably is generally true, but what are the instances where it wasn't? What if we pick a commit at random? Can you showcase to me that uh, there was a multi-party review, that it is signed, that it occurred hermetically, that the testing passed the threshold rather than giving me an average across the spread of all commits, that you have a container image scan. So on average, for a regulated organization, depending on who's asking the question or who they need to prove it, they should be a range of like 20 to 30 different attestations for the different controls. If we look, I talked about SSDF as one of the newer practices. There's 42 aspects uh, to SSDF. If we look at something like SOX, is yet again like 20 to 25 attributes that you should be showcasing. So the fact that you put these controls and you're collecting this evidence and you're evaluating it to say pass or fail, you could go fully automated to say if something is not passing, we're going to gate the deploy to production or whatever target environment this is being deployed to. So there is that higher proof where that you could be producing and making it understandable. And ideally, it shouldn't be, if someone wants to be agile at how they audit, they shouldn't have a person on the other side manually inspecting that the sturdy things are in place. Yeah, it should be great to have uh, some visualization that it happens, but it should also be evaluated by a machine on the other end to ensure there's nothing being overlooked.
Yeah. And what you described, this other thought that maybe this is what you were talking about before, and it's just I'm just catching up with you. But this notion of almost like what are the atomic units of evidence, I guess, is maybe the best word. But for the different, like, 42 different aspects for SSDF, 20 to 25 attributes for I mean, if you stack all these things together, you're gonna have a lot you're gonna have a lot of things that maybe overlap, or if you handled it the right way, build um, you could sort of simplify the overall process and extract, like, these are the sort of the atomic units of um, checks and
Sure.
controls that we have, that from those you can extrapolate to that regulation, this regulation over here, regulation ABC, right? Um, with kind of well thought out unit level controls. Am I making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the parlance of governance and compliance, people tend to talk about attestations, but
Mhm.
there's like little a attestation and capital A attestation.
Right.
A lot of where the recent discourse is converging towards are, what is a well-formed attestation? If we think of, like, we've been talking about cloud native, and one of the precursors to cloud native were the 12 form factor.
Mhm.
What is the 12 form factor of an attestation? So you should have an event declaration. An attestation should clearly specify that a specific event occurred, and that event should have like the action of series of actions that took place for that claim you're making. There should be asset identification, all the assets involved in the application call chain, saying that this event pertained to this. These are the software components. These are the microservices of this app. And this is like an assertion for this specific microservice. There should be a timestamp and context to it. There should be a verbose description of the condition. What is the outcome of the event that's being provided? And what is the end state of it? Uh, Layered upon it, the policy compliance check, because the fact that something has a life cycle or a mutation or the different states, it's somewhat disconnected from how it's supposed to behave. And then verifiability, that it can be replayed, it can be reproduced, and ultimately, like, what's the entity that's making that attestation. These are things that I talked about, that 2019 paper. Right now we're revising it, but from the CNCF, and saying like, hey, a lot of people have set off, some startups have built commercial offerings based on that architecture that was described, but doing a balanced check of like, okay, where are those efforts today? What is the state of the art? What are the gaps between those things? Has a methodology arised on how to produce these things that the paper described? And the in between, there was a summoning the year after the paper was published in 2020 to write a follow on paper and incorporate uh, the cloud native bits to it. But interestingly enough, John Willis, who had coordinated the effort, uh, realized that it wasn't that compelling to do yet another academic paper, and it'd be more relatable if we did something in the vein of the Phoenix Project that described the organizational dynamics of someone trying to do this. So there is a book on automated governance, part of the ITREF, the Phoenix Project. It's called Investments Unlimited. If you're a fan of the series, you get the nod to Parts Unlimited. Uh, I
Mm.
think we should have called it like the something project, like the Minotaur project or the Griffin project, so people don't think it's like a book on investment for newbies or something. Anyhow, the story gets to the point, and it's inspired by events that happened at the time. There were uh, multinational banks that were suddenly being fined, and they were being fined in the order of magnitude of millions of dollars for deficiencies in the risk programs. So the book is centered on a large, high growth financial services organization that, throughout its growth, hasn't had to deal with a lot of regulation, but they exceed the threshold of $20 billion, which gives them a lot more scrutiny. And typically, organizations like progressively as they mature, regulators are very accommodating to say like, okay, like you were a high growth startup, but now you're public and you didn't have a person in charge of risk. Now you need to designate someone in charge of risk, and you need to do this program, and then we're going to come check on you. So there's leniency to a point. But what occurred was we saw this fines. A large Asian bank, that has a global presence, got a cease and desist letter from the regulator in the United States, and failing to uh, respond to it over a series of notices, they eventually got a cease and desist. So this is very high stakes in certain industries. So we wrote the book inspired by those events. This company, by all Dora measures, does great, but they start getting these letters from the regulator. They get a MRA, matter requires attention. Then they get 11 more of those during the course of a year, and then they get a letter that's a whole lot more serious, which precedes the cease and desist, called the MRIA, matter requires immediate attention. And for all they think that they're building software right, they're failing to demonstrate that they're doing the things they're supposed to. So understanding the complexity of the system, what is the best approach, what are the heuristics to capture the proof, to store the evidence so it can be retrieved at a later time. I joke that many organizations have built a version of this, but it fails, much like many platform efforts. Uh, a lot of the energy is spent on onboarding an application or a business unit, but there's not a lot of thought on the abstraction of generic interfaces so it can be consumed by others to come at a later time. So there's a lot of rewrites and architectures involved if you build something that works for a part of the company but not for everyone else, or it's just a very unique artisan way to do things, but your peers, say you merge with another bank or you acquire another bank, and things don't jive anymore. So there's a lot of platforms that don't receive large adoption around automated governance because, again, it's just for a very specific or particular set of workflows that don't accommodate uh, general general developers or other more modern ways of doing things. So that's some of what we see. And again, like ultimately, if as we've done in some areas of security engineering where things are no longer wired up ad hoc, but a lot of functions have become automated tasks as a function of the underlying infrastructure, and the engineers don't need to like do their own scanner or write their own TLS library, and they can either have these functions in the sky or underneath the platform rather than do it themselves. Uh, is what we're striving for with this governance tasks. Have a automated governor perform these checks, make determinations of yes, you've hit these things, and if not, translate it back in an intelligible way. If you tell me, oh, I failed line 47 of this mandate, but it's not clear to me as an engineer, like how should I go implement that because it's legalese. Having common tools and libraries, and also more context and a better description to here are here's what this implemented requirement would look like in code. Here's what you're going to need to fix. Uh, it eliminates a lot of that toil and back and forth that occurs of someone in the legal department saying like you're not hitting this thing, you're not doing that thing. Just having it translated to a Kanban board or a set of tasks of go write the software is is a much better explanation of like why this thing is not passing.
Okay. And this is, you're coming back to kind of this other point that you made earlier about, savvy organizations that are actually hiring in software engineers into, kind of a newish role that maybe in the past would have been supported by someone from a legal department, but it kind of has left this gap that's basically meant that individual development teams have to translate the legal verbiage of this is what your software needs to do, or this is what we need to be able to see that your software is doing or did do, and they have to build from scratch. And so you're kind of getting at both the notion of the platform economics, again making a nod to last week's discussion, the platform economics that should be, well, I guess maybe it's just aspirational, but like if you can achieve that, then you could offload a lot of toil from your individual development teams, because you've got sort of a platform approach to how all these attestations are going to be done. But you also probably need a person who's like, an engineer or a small team of engineers who are directly thinking about what's the tooling that we need to make available to individual development teams so that this is automated and they're not rebuilding every single time their own way. Is that?
Yeah, I think there's a big like socio-technical consideration, and we can like the exemplar of that is like Borg and SRE, or like Kubernetes and SRE, where like from an economic standpoint, historically we've had attention, and there's like very like Jay Bloom in ergonautic. He did a PhD on Carnegie Mellon, and he talks about the three economies of IT, and it's like a juxtaposition on crossing the chasm from no more, where on the left side it's not innovators, it's a economy that wins by setting themselves apart from anyone else, and they do so by creating as many variances as rapidly as possible from the thing they're building, and that's like the typical engineering mindset. On the right hand side of crossing the chasm, you have what people typically call laggards, but you actually have organizations that have an economy of scale or cost, which they win the game by doing things consistently and repeatedly. And that's where compliance and governance typically come in place. So there's this class where like unless like you merge the two, and what Borg and SRE did very well, you wrote the automation for the platform to keep the promises in place, but there's a lot of domain driven design that the engineer takes the inputs, they model the software to match the domain. So they model the software to model like web scale operations of software. And compliance, we haven't necessarily modeled the GRC, the governance, risk, and compliance concerns. So yes, you can get an engineer to automate a lot of these things, and we have a lot of metadata and the act of building software that is produced. But if I compile and I collate that metadata from the systems today and hand it on to an auditor, it's not going to be what they expect to see. If I were to sit with the GRC expert and say like, hey, tell me what is it that you want and what you expect to see, I can cater to those considerations and I can model the software so the thing doesn't fall flat when I present it to them. So there's like that social technical consideration of we got to bring the auditors and the regulators on board. And talking to a large multinational bank that is a big fan of the framework, building on the DevOps automated governance, and how we're revising it. Their ideal outcome and end state is if someone's shipping software and that software trips the wire for something that's non-compliant, for that incident to be immediately escalated to the GRC person so they can have the conversation right there and then and develop this shared understanding of what needs changing. If they need to rewrite the whole code, that they can do it right there rather than this. For all that we talked like CI, CD, in many of these regulated places, there's no such thing as CD. It's not continuous. You uh, in order to ship the software, it needs to go through a change management board
Mm-hmm.
that is going to inspect for all these things. So rather than awaiting for the 12-week cap to come back and say, hey, we found something that needs changing here, how do we shorten that feedback loop? So yes, there's still like conversations and people involved in the mix, but we can have the computer actually participate in shortening, like, hey, rather than waiting 12 weeks to arrive at this conclusion, there's something that is somewhat dubious here that warrants a conversation, warrants a discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, getting that sort of flagged. And this relates to the last point. I know we're already kind of over our usual time, but I'm going to squeeze in one more question.
Yeah.
You had commented before in our sort of prep exchange about just the idea of bringing some SRE concepts to the world of kind of risk and compliance. And I think we're kind of we're in that zone now. Like what you're just describing, I can already hear some of those pieces, but I wanted to hear more explicitly. Like, tell me more about that. Like, what does that mean? What do you think that looks like? I think folks would find that really interesting.
For sure. So that, like, we haven't talked about risk, but like risk is a discipline where like you have actuary science and you have actuaries like quantifying risk, bring some of that in order to rationalize what is a structural risk and what is variable risk to the subset of attributes that have, like, if you think of risk as equaling probability of something happening, and if it does happen, what's the impact of that? Like risk equals probability plus impact. How do you rationalize and think about holistically to grant that a score of its exploitability or of it going sideways? And having done that for the different set of properties of, I mean, we can think easily about vulnerabilities and bugs. What is your vulnerability threshold? What is your threshold for how long can a vulnerability go unpatched? What is the timeline to mitigate and remediate and working within some bounds and defining a security objective, as you would have like a service level objective or service level agreement, have this contracts between the different stakeholders between R&D and risk, and have a budget around this items. I think it's super interesting, and it's certainly a direction where we're converging towards, and people are starting to talk in those terms and trying to abide by disagreements.
Yeah, it's a really interesting space, and the idea of, yeah, if you can create that quantification, just like availability is something that's uh, mm, can be directly quantified. Um, there may be a bunch of other factors that can feed into it that you might have to look at a little bit differently, but it becomes this end state. So uh, that I think is super interesting. I know we've gone a little over our normal time. I wanted to thank you. This has been a super interesting discussion, and I appreciate like just all the great thinking that you've shared. I feel uh, really excited about how organizations can be doing more around this, and also just like the challenge that it presents. But it's really exciting to hear, and thank you for letting us know about kind of some of the work underway for in the CNCF group to update that paper. Is that something that there's a timeline around when that can be expected? I know we've got KubeCon Paris coming up in just a couple of weeks.
So right now we have a pretty good outline. I just shared the link in our chat here in StreamYard. I don't know if that can go to everyone.
Yeah.
So the document is divided in two major sections. There's like very heavy thinking I attempted to convey is made somewhat more palatable in there, with a lot of what's the impetus, what the motivation for the work is. We're looking for capturing down a very strong specification of the architecture. We're hoping for it to be completed not for KubeCon Europe, but for KubeCon North America in the second half of the year. We've had pretty good participation from folks across the board, public sector, private sector, both United States and Australia, and we're starting to see, a lot of great contribution that we're hoping to bring out and showcase to everyone else. And maybe the one nod, knowing while we worked together at VMware for a little bit, there's a lot of influence from a Pivotal in here. Like we go back to like James Waters and Justin Smith thinking about the 3 R's and applying like those 3 R's of rotate, repave, refactor applied to GRC. And we talked about SRE a lot, but I think it's worthwhile to recognize the Pivotal lineage to this.
Oh, yeah, I love it. That just warms my heart. All right, well, thank you, and I'm going to grab a hold of that outline to just drop in some of the other comments for folks with some of the other resources, including the Investments Unlimited. I love the nod to Parts Unlimited if you enjoyed the original Phoenix project. So again, Andres, thank you so much. Folks, I'll see you back here in a couple of weeks if I don't see you at Monkey Gras next week. And until then, have an uneventful day.
Yes, well, the Unplanned project.
That's my life. That's just Monday. Thank you.